They say that a child's first cry is a celebration, the first breath, the first sound of life. But mine, it was treated like a curse. A siren scream that signaled the end of my parents' dreams, at least in their eyes. I don't remember being born, but my mother never let me forget how inconvenient it was for her. "You ruined everything," she'd say, her voice cold, almost rehearsed, like it was a daily affirmation she whispered to herself. I was accepted into college abroad. Your father had a job offer in another city, and then you came along. My earliest memories aren't of toys or bedtime stories. They're of slammed doors, quiet sobbing that wasn't mine, and glares that lingered too long. When other kids brought home macaroni art for the fridge, I hid mine in drawers. I learned quickly that nothing I created was ever good enough to make up for the crime of being born. I was 5 when my mother first said it to my face. I was standing in the kitchen, barefoot and holding a crumpled drawing I'd made of her. "Look, Mommy! You have wings!" I beamed. She didn't even glance at the paper. She was washing dishes furiously, as if scrubbing away something deeper than grease. Her hands stopped. She turned, soaked, and looked at me like I was a stain she couldn't remove. "Do you know what you are?" she asked quietly. I remember the silence stretching, making the air heavy. A mistake. I didn't cry. I didn't know how to yet. I just nodded, dropped the drawing and walked away. From then on, I stopped drawing angels. My father wasn't cruel in words, he was cruel in absence. He was home every day, but never present. He'd watch TV while I ate alone. When I tried to talk about school, he'd nod without listening. The only time he acknowledged me was when I did something wrong. "You always want attention, don't you?" he barked one evening when I accidentally spilled milk on the carpet. "Typical. Just like your mother said. Our lives were fine before you." The sentence clung to the walls long after he left the room. I started to believe them. Why wouldn't I? I was a child, trying to piece together a world that seemed broken from the beginning. School was my only escape, though even there, I carried the weight of being the quiet girl with sad eyes. Teachers praised my grades but pitied my silence. Friends came and went, confused by my emotional distance, unsure how to connect with someone who flinched when they laughed too loudly. I learned to smile so no one would ask questions. I learned to hide bruises of the heart better than bruises of the skin. My 12th birthday was when I stopped celebrating at all. My parents forgot, or pretended to. I came home to an empty house. No cake. No happy birthday. Just a note on the fridge. "Dinner's in the microwave. Don't make a mess." That night I sat on the floor, watching the microwave spin cold leftovers, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I had ruined their lives. Maybe they could have been happy, traveled, succeeded, smiled more, if not for me. But then something inside me shifted. A small, almost invisible flicker. Maybe it wasn't me. Maybe they were the problem. It took years for that thought to grow, to root itself inside the soil of my spirit. But it was there, quietly blooming beneath the rubble of shame. I began noticing things. How other kids talked about their parents with affection, how teachers encouraged them, how strangers smiled at babies instead of glaring at them like ticking time bombs. And one day, at 15, I asked my mother directly, "Why did you have me if you didn't want me?" She turned from her mirror, halfway through applying lipstick, and laughed bitterly. "Because we didn't have a choice. I was stupid, and your father didn't believe in abortion. So we got stuck. With you. Stuck with me." She said it so casually, like she was talking about a broken appliance. That night, I looked in the mirror for a long time, searching for the monster they claimed I was. But all I saw was a girl. Thin, tired, and quietly drowning. That's when I promised myself something. I would not be the girl who begged for love. I would not be the woman who clung to people who hated her. And I would never, ever, become like them. But leaving wasn't easy. I was still under their roof, under their rules, under the shadow of their contempt. So I played along. I smiled when they insulted me. I obeyed when they snapped. I kept my head down, my grades up, and my hope hidden deep where they couldn't reach it, because I knew, one day I'd escape. Not in some dramatic explosion, but quietly, softly, like smoke slipping through a crack in the window. They wouldn't even notice I was gone. And when I did, oh when I did, I would rebuild everything they tried to destroy. But not yet. First, I had to survive. The summer I turned 17, something in me finally snapped. It wasn't a dramatic breakdown or a violent argument. It was quieter than that. A subtle fracture, like ice cracking beneath your feet. Invisible at first, but dangerous all the same. It started with a dinner. A bland, silent meal like any other. My mother sat across from me scrolling through her phone, occasionally stabbing her fork into overcooked chicken. My father barely looked up from the television in the living room, half shouting about a sports team I couldn't care less about. The smell of burnt oil filled the air. The silence between us was thicker than the food. And then, out of nowhere, my mother sighed. A waste of 18 years. She muttered, not looking at me. I didn't respond. I didn't flinch. I just stared at my plate. Excuse me? I asked softly. She looked up like she'd forgotten I was there. I said, raising you is a waste. We gave up everything. And what do we get? Nothing. Just a girl with her nose in books and no future. My father grunted in agreement from the couch. You're not even pretty. At least that'd be useful. The words didn't pierce like they used to. They didn't carve holes into my chest the way they once did. Maybe I had finally developed scar tissue. Maybe I had grown numb. Or maybe I had simply stopped caring. That night, I didn't cry. I packed. It began slowly. A book here, a piece of clothing there. I used old boxes from the garage and tucked them beneath my bed. I told my parents I was cleaning. They barely looked up. I got a part-time job at the local bookstore, lying and saying it was for college savings. The truth. It was my escape fund. Every coin, every tip, every shift I worked after school, I held onto like a lifeline. Some nights I stayed up late in the back room, secretly applying to community colleges and affordable dorms out of state. I learned how to open a bank account without a parent's signature. I studied scholarships, low-income grants, and how to file for financial aid. Nobody helped me. Nobody asked. I became my own mother, father, and savior. But the hardest part wasn't the logistics. It was pretending. Pretending like I was still their daughter. Like I still cared. Like the meals they tossed my way meant something. Like their birthdays or anniversaries deserved any effort from me. It felt like living with ghosts. Not the kind that haunted, but the kind that refused to see you. Then, the night finally came. A Friday, late August. The end of summer, the beginning of the rest of my life. I had packed everything I could into a second-hand duffel bag. My savings, a little over $600, was zipped into the front pocket. Not much, but enough to get me on a bus and out of town. I left a note. Not because they deserved one, but because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of calling the police and pretending they cared. I'm not missing. I'm not dead. I'm just gone. You said I ruined your lives. Now you're free. Don't look for me. You won't find me. I placed it on the kitchen counter and took one last look around. The house was dark. Silent, cold. I didn't feel sadness. Or regret. Just release. I closed the door behind me and walked into the night. The bus station smelled like old coffee and exhaustion. I paid in cash, keeping my head down, avoiding eye contact. My hands shook slightly as I held the ticket. But inside, under the fear, there was something else. Peace. I was finally moving. Finally breaking the cycle. I didn't know where I was going, not exactly. But I knew where I wasn't. And that was enough. The first night on my own was harder than I imagined. The bus took me to a nearby city where I'd applied to a community college. I slept at a 24-hour diner for a few hours, nursing a cup of cheap tea while pretending to study. A kind waitress let me rest in a booth until sunrise. She never asked questions, just gave me a soft smile and an extra muffin. Her name was Gloria. I will never forget her kindness. The next day, I checked into the cheapest hostel I could find, and started the process of enrolling in classes. I used my job reference and filed for aid. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But it was mine. Every day was a fight. A battle against exhaustion, doubt, and loneliness. I worked mornings at the bookstore, afternoons in class, evenings studying in library corners, eating dollar store noodles and dreaming of something better. There were nights I cried myself to sleep in a shared dorm bed, wondering if I had made a mistake. Wondering if I had what it took. Wondering if the voice of my mother was right all along. You'll never make it. You're not strong enough. But I remembered that last night in the house. The silence. The note. And I whispered back, watch me. A one day turned into a week into a month into a year. The pain didn't disappear, but it dulled. It stopped owning me. I started making friends, real friends. People who didn't see me as a burden or a disappointment. I joined a writing club. I shared stories I had never told anyone. And for the first time, people listened. They didn't flinch at my past. They didn't pity me. They admired me. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to admire myself too. I didn't just escape that house. I escaped the belief that I was worthless. That I was broken. That I was the problem. No, I had never ruined anyone's life. I had survived the people who tried to ruin mine, and soon, I would do more than survive. I would rise. The hardest part of escaping wasn't leaving. It was what came after. There's a kind of silence that follows freedom. Not peaceful, not comforting. It's the silence of unfamiliar ceilings, blank calendars, and no one to tell you what to do next. It was the first time in my life I wasn't being told I was a mistake, but it was also the first time I had no one to tell me I was doing anything right. The early months were brutal. I lived in a rotating mix of shelters, low-income student housing, and short-term rentals. Every dollar I spent had to be stretched like skin over bone. I sold old clothes on consignment, skipped meals, and downloaded every free budgeting app I could find. I kept working at the bookstore. It didn't pay much, but it was quiet, filled with paper and possibility. And the manager, a lie, saw something in me no one else ever had. "You read more than anyone I've met," he said one evening while watching me reorganize the philosophy section alphabetically. "You ever think about being a writer?" I laughed softly. "Writers need something worth saying." He tilted his head. "You've lived, haven't you? That's worth more than most have to say." That stayed with me. Because the truth was, I had lived, and I was still living. Climbing slowly out of a life I wasn't supposed to survive. The library became my second home. I devoured books on trauma, healing, and the stories of women who rebuilt themselves from the ashes. I began to journal, at first privately, then with more confidence. My pain started to take shape. Not just as memory, but as meaning. I wasn't just surviving. I was learning who I was. At school, I studied psychology and literature. I was fascinated by what made people cruel. But even more fascinated by what made people heal. I wasn't the loudest in class, but professors took notice of my essays. They were raw, emotionally intelligent, and brutally honest. One even pulled me aside. "You don't just write from knowledge," she said. "You write from somewhere deeper." I nodded, unsure how to respond. The truth. I was writing from scar tissue. As the seasons passed, I began to find stability. I earned a scholarship for students who'd overcome adversity. It wasn't a full ride, but it lifted a weight I'd carried alone for far too long. I moved into a small studio. Just 300 square feet, but mine. I bought a second-hand kettle and made tea at night, the scent of chamomile filling the silence with something that almost felt like peace. On weekends I started tutoring kids at a local youth center. Kids who came from homes like mine, with eyes too old for their age. I didn't tell them my story, not yet. I just listened, encouraged, showed up. Because no one ever did that for me. One girl, Mia, reminded me of myself, quiet, guarded, brilliant. "You think you're broken, don't you?" I asked her once after she bombed a test she'd clearly been too afraid to study for. She looked away. Shrugged. I did too. I told her. But broken things can still grow. They just grow differently. She didn't reply, but I saw her writing more after that. Her posture changed. Her walls cracked. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night still expecting to hear my mother's voice, cold and cutting, echoing through my memories. But the silence was different now. It wasn't heavy. It was healing. One spring afternoon, nearly 2 years after I left, I got a letter. From them. My parents. The handwriting was unmistakable. I stood in the hallway of my building, envelope trembling in my hands. I told myself not to open it. But I did. It was short. "We heard you're in college. Good for you. We hope you've matured and realized how hard parenting is. We did the best we could. If you ever want to visit, the door's open. Mom and Dad. No apology. No remorse. Just entitlement dressed as civility." I stared at it for a long time, then tore it into pieces and flushed it down the toilet. That was closure, not forgiveness. Release. Success didn't happen overnight. There were still bills, breakups, breakdowns. But there was also momentum. I launched a blog where I anonymously shared my story, pieces of it, masked through fiction and poetry. To my surprise, people began to follow, to comment, to message. I thought I was alone. You put my feelings into words. You helped me leave. And suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. 3 years after I escaped, I graduated with honors. I stood on a stage, trembling, staring at a sea of strangers who had no idea what it took for me to get there. No family in the audience, no applause from blood. But my friends, my real chosen family, screamed my name like I was someone worth celebrating. And for the first time in my life, I believed them. That summer, I signed a deal to publish my first book. A memoir in disguise. A collection of essays, poems, and fragments of a life that tried to destroy itself before learning how to rebuild. My therapist called it poetic justice. I called it the beginning, because I wasn't done. Not even close. Not the movie kind, no screaming confrontations, no public takedowns. Just a moment. A single second where I could look them in the eye and think, "You were wrong about me." But when that moment finally came, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like victory. My book came out in the fall, Daughter of the Ashes. It was marketed as fiction, but anyone who had lived a life like mine could read between the lines. The response was overwhelming. It started small, a few emails, late, night DMs, Instagram tags. Then came the interviews, podcasts, invitations to speak at conferences about emotional abuse, survival, and healing. Suddenly, my name was in rooms my parents could never enter. Not because they were locked out, but because they never had the courage to walk through the same fires I had. One of the first big interviews I gave was for a local radio station. I sat across from a soft, spoken host who leaned in halfway through the segment and asked, "If your parents are listening right now, what would you want to say to them?" I paused. There was a time I would have answered with rage, accusations, tears. But I had long since buried that girl, so I said simply, "Nothing. They've heard enough of my voice. This one's for everyone who was told they were a burden, and decided to carry themselves anyway." The host blinked, nodded slowly. "You carry yourself well," he said. I smiled. Took a while to learn how. It was strange, how the world opened for me once I stopped asking for permission. I gave workshops at shelters, visited high schools, wrote for national publications. I made enough money to finally breathe, to donate, to sponsor scholarships for girls like me. Quiet girls with brilliant minds and nowhere to go. I bought a small apartment near the sea. Nothing extravagant. But every tile, every curtain, every cup in the cabinet was mine. Chosen. Earned. Some mornings, I would wake up to sunlight streaming through the windows and cry. Not because I was sad, but because I had never imagined safety could feel so beautiful. And then, one day, they showed up. It started with a message. A simple email subject: "Congratulations. We saw your book. We're proud of you. Maybe it's time we talk." Mom and Dad. I stared at the screen for a long time. No apology. Just a request to share in a victory they never believed in. A desperate reach toward the child they discarded. Now that she'd made something of herself. I didn't respond, not out of spite, but out of respect for the woman I had become. I didn't owe them closure. I didn't owe them gratitude. They hadn't built me. They had broken me. I had rebuilt myself. Weeks later, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. "Hello," I said. There was silence, then, "It's your mother." The voice was older, slower, but still sharp. "I assume you saw the email," she continued. We were thinking we could meet. Maybe talk things out. Let go of the past." I stood at my window, watching waves crash against the rocks far below. "I did let go of the past," I said calmly. "A long time ago." A pause. Then defensively, "We weren't perfect, okay? But we were young. You don't know what it was like. We had no money. We didn't want a kid. We were scared." I didn't flinch. "You could have been scared and still been kind," I replied. Her voice cracked then, maybe from guilt or just age. "We didn't know how to love you." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I know. And I don't hate you for it. But I don't need you now. I needed you then." Silence. "I hope you're okay," I added. And then, gently but firmly, I hung up. That was the last time I heard her voice. I didn't block her. I didn't send a cruel message. I simply let the silence do what their words never could: protect me. In the years that followed, life continued blooming. I became a therapist, specializing in inner child healing and emotional trauma. I used everything they gave me: the wounds, the rage, the rejection, and turned it into a map for others trying to find their way out of the dark. I spoke at universities, started a nonprofit, mentored survivors, and I wrote. I wrote. Every poem, every page, every paragraph was a brick in the foundation of a new life. On the 10th anniversary of my escape, I sat alone at a cafe with a slice of cake, red velvet, my favorite. I lit a single candle, not for my birthday, for my rebirth. I whispered, "You didn't ruin anyone's life, you saved your own," and blew the candle out. People ask me now, do you ever wish your childhood had been different? Of course. But I also know this. A flower that grows through concrete blooms with strength nothing planted in a garden can understand. They said I was a mistake. They said I ruined their lives. But what they didn't realize was this. I was never their ending. I was always my own beginning.